am so honored and excited to welcome both Charles Person and Richard Rooker to speak today. Charles Person is one of two living freedom riders who remain from the original ride, its start in Washington, D.C. all the way to New Orleans. This historic event helped to defeat Jim Crow laws in the United States, and we'll hear a lot about it today. Person maintains active contact with schools, museums, and is an activist in the community. He lives in Atlanta. Richard Rooker is an English teacher and history educator, writing coach, and longtime personal friend of Person. He's an active board member of the Indiana Historical Society. All right, and with that, welcome Charles and Richard. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you, Emma. I'm Richard Rooker, co-author of Charles Person's just released book, as Emma said, Buses Are A-Coming, Memoir of a Freedom Rider. Charles and I are excited to be here this evening because we appreciate the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy's mission to promote respect and understanding between the people of Utah and other people, and that you foster citizen diplomacy through meaningful person-to-person interaction. So tonight, Charles and I want to interact together with you, one metaphorical handshake at a time. So Charles, I have some questions for you. All set?
I guess so. Yes,
right.
I'm ready.
All right, well, let's go. So I'd like to start, Charles, by having you tell our viewers briefly what Freedom Ride 1961 was and why Freedom Ride 1961 was necessary.
Very good question. Freedom Rides essentially was a test. It was a test to see if the South would honor the Sioux Supreme Court decisions and to see if they would comply. And the answer was a resounding no in most cases. It was necessary because most of the people in the nation they were not aware of how Jim Crow affected Black people. We were riders who had paid a full fare, but we were treated entirely different. And that was one of the reasons why it was essentially necessary that we undertake this particular project.
Well, we'll come back to the Freedom Rides for sure, Charles, but I'd like to explore just a little bit the nature of protest, demonstration, and resistance to bring about needed change in society. So can you tell us what strategies you utilized in the Atlanta student movement and on the Freedom Rides that were effective against the segregationists you faced?
Our methods of protest varied. We had marches, and this was to demonstrate the solidarity of the students. We conducted sit-ins, wait-ins. We did everything to upset and disrupt business as usual. And the idea is that we had to get someone's attention. We as Americans, sometimes we forget how people in other states and other regions live. And I guess the Black people in the South have been screaming out for years and years and years, and no one was listening. But once the students started the sit-ins, and that led to all kinds of demonstrations and boycotts. And finally, I think the culmination of the sit-in movement was the Freedom Rides, because the Freedom Rides incorporated not only sit-ins, but other forms of protest. But the idea was to get people to understand what was happening to us and to develop people to support us and to be our allies and to help us win our freedom and to break down the laws of Jim Crow.
Well, so these strategies you used, I want to draw a delineation here with civil disobedience. So civil disobedience, both Mohandas Gandhi and Dr. King both believe strongly in civil disobedience, the principle that we must resist unjust laws. But the Freedom Rides, Charles, were not really civil disobedience. They were instead nonviolent direct action. Can you explain the difference between those?
Sure. Civil disobedience is when you protest unfair laws or laws that you feel that are unjust. But we were protesting the fact that the law had been passed in our favor. We were complying with the law. It was the states that didn't allow us to use all the facilities and ride the buses where we should, they were the ones breaking the law. So civil disobedience is disobeying a law, a lawful order, a lawful law, whereas we were demonstrating against it's a system where we are already allowed to have access to these particular facilities.
Yeah, and Gandhi in his teachings, actually in this book right here, Satyagraha, Nonviolent Resistance, teaches, and I'm going to quote from there, we must give greater value to the adjective civil than to the noun disobedience. And we just talked about how the freedom rides were not civil disobedience, but they put an emphasis certainly on being civil. So can you talk to us about the ways that the students in both the Atlanta student movement and the riders on the freedom rides practiced the action, the intentional action of being civil?
Well, civil relates to ordinary people. We were ordinary passengers doing ordinary things in an ordinary country, and we were not allowed to do them. And that is the essence of what we were about. And to maintain our civility, we always maintained that everyone who participated had to be nonviolent. That was the key. You had to be nonviolent.
And I know that for James Farmer, at least of CORE, part of it was to provoke a crisis, perhaps. I mean, ideally, you would be able to travel as normal passengers on normal buses, but perhaps provoke a crisis where your civility would be in contrast to the incivility aligned against you, and society would have to make a choice against that. And I really admire how you were able to maintain your civility in the midst of all the violence that you faced on your freedom ride. So Charles, your freedom ride journey starts on May 4th, 1961, right about this time.
Yeah.
60 years ago in Washington, D.C. But I think we could say your path to the journey started a lot earlier than that. I think we could pick a few places. So one place we might start is in your not being able to eat at the Majestic Diner in Atlanta as a teenager, actually a 12-year-old, when non-white international college students were able to eat there, but you weren't. Tell us about that and how that affected you.
Well, that was my first encounter openly, a situation where no one could explain to me what was going on. I was at the Majestic Diner, and it still exists today. And I had left my lunch at home, so I had to eat out this particular day. And when we go to the Majestic Diner and we get there, and I go to a booth, and that's a no-no. And then my colleagues, the other fellow pinboys, they explained to me that I couldn't sit down and eat. Yet there were students from Georgia Tech, from Iran and other places, many of them as dark as I was, and yet they were allowed to eat. So I couldn't understand if color was a problem, it shouldn't have been, I was as dark as they were. And it was my first attempt to deal with how racism was not so much about a matter of color as a matter of origin. So if I had been a foreigner, they would have had no problem serving me. But since I was just a native born of the South, but I just had to have a little bit of melanin in my pigment, that was not sufficient to get me lunch that particular day. But it was a difficult lesson to learn, but it stuck. It stuck, believe me.
Yeah. Another place we could think of your journey starting on the road to your activism was when you were rejected as a senior in high school from attending Georgia Tech after being accepted at MIT. So how did that rejection put you on your path to activism?
A lot of times, some situations and certain things cannot be explained. And, I was encouraged to be a good student and to obey my parents and do those things that are right. So I couldn't not accept the fact that I was being rejected. And Georgia Tech made it very difficult because it wasn't a matter of academics. They didn't reject me because of academics. They didn't reject me because of race, but they did reject me because I could not get two members of the alumni to recommend me, which they knew were, in most cases, would be almost impossible for a Black person to get previous graduates to support you. And it hurt. Like I said, there was no way my parents or anyone could explain to me the logic. You know, MIT was one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Georgia Tech was a very good school too. And, you know, I met all the qualifications. Otherwise, I couldn't understand. And it was difficult for anyone to explain to me why it was not accepted.
And Charles, I think a third place we might think of your journey to activism and the freedom rides starting is when you joined the Atlanta student movement to desegregate the Atlanta restaurants and department stores when you reached Morehouse College, which led to your going to jail and even solitary confinement. So why did you join the Atlanta student movement?
The Atlanta student movement gave me an opportunity to do something about some of the early things that had happened to me. If we were going to be successful, then all the things that I had complained about earlier would no longer be a problem. So that was a motivation. Also, getting with other students, you realize that the situation in other parts of the country was not like it was in the South. I mean, other kids, they had to conform from the North and the West who came to Morehouse, they had to conform to Jim Crow laws, and they weren't used to that. So they're letting us know what life was like in New York and Chicago and other places really just kind of perked your interest. So that, along with other things, you know, his was an opportunity for me to do something, and I volunteered.
Yeah, and in your activism with the Atlanta student movement, you get arrested and you end up in solitary confinement for sitting on a lunch stool and with two of your colleagues that you called yourselves the guerrillas, and there's a meat cleaver story. Just touch on that for a second. I've never been confronted with a meat cleaver before.
There was one restaurant that was very popular in Atlanta, especially during the lunch hour, because it had very good food and it was a great location. And I used to like to go there because they had about 40 stools at the lunch counter. Well, Leon Green and Frank Holloway and myself, the three of us could go into a lunchroom that size and shut it completely down. And we spread out because whites didn't want to sit near us. So instead of, you know, them have a portion of the counter, they had none. But this one day, the manager came out with meat cleaver, and he brandished it and he threatened us and everything. But one of the good things, one of the sit-inners with me was Frank Holloway, and he was a big man. He was about 6'4", and when he would cross his arm, he looked down on people, and he was very intimidating. But he was as meek as a lamb. So I always like to be near Frank because I was so small. I was only 5'6" and 126 pounds, so I wasn't much of a threat to anybody. But being in Frank's presence made it a lot easier to deal with situations like the meat cleaver, because even though the guy had a meat cleaver, he still was intimidated by Frank.
Well, yeah, and you just said you like to be near Frank, but you and Frank and Leon weren't, as I think I would have been, 1, 2, 3 sitting side by side by side. Why did you spread out?
Well, we spread it out because that way we could eliminate more people from the lunch counter. In fact, it got to the point where we could strategically place ourselves and the lunch counter would be completely shut down.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was amazing when you taught me how you intentionally spread out because no whites wanted to sit next to a black, and if you sat together, you'd have 2 empty seats. But if you spread out, you'd have lots of empty seats. between you. That, I think that was clever. So how did you actually become one of the original 13 Freedom Riders?
Luck, probably more than well. I, like others, applied when Corps sent out the Congress of Racial Equality sent out an edict. They wanted to draft people to become Freedom Riders. Well, nobody knew what a Freedom Rider was in those days, but anytime to fight segregation at any place, anytime, I would have volunteered. But still, there was no guarantee that I was going to be selected. I, along with several other members from Atlanta, applied, and for some reason, I was selected. And many years later, I found out that one of the reasons I think that I was selected because I was relatively squeaky clean. I hadn't lived long enough to do too many things. The only bad thing I had on my record was I had been in jail for 16 days. But I was in jail for a good reason. I wasn't there for any felony or anything like that. But other than that, I think that's the only reason. Because Corps wanted to make sure that there were no information that would distract from what they were trying to do. They didn't want me to get arrested. They were talking more about my personal life than about my desire to integrate a lunch counter or restroom.
So we want to know about the Freedom Ride journey itself and what that was like. And Charles, the Utah Council's logo is two people shaking hands on a bridge. And the other night at a session, the last question the moderator had for you was, what is the best advice you have to give us as we leave this conversation? And you answered that question with just 3 words. You said, make a friend. And part of your Freedom Ride journey was meeting white riders, many of them decades older than you, and you were surprised by them, but you made friends. So tell us about the white riders you formed friendships with and the surprise they were to you.
You have to remember what I said earlier. There are a lot of things that happened that I couldn't explain. And in Atlanta student movement, we had very few whites. I think maybe one white person that participated. So when I got to DC for the training, and I see these white people, and I'm wondering, wow, why are they here? I didn't know their backgrounds. I didn't know very much about them. Some of the names I had heard, but I didn't know anything extensively about it. So what I did is, to try to pick their brains to find out, what motivated them. And boy, I tell you, with the information I found out, I mean, you had educators, you had millionaires, you had Navy captains, you had people of all walks of life. And I'm saying, if these people can risk their wealth, their status in life, for my freedom and the freedom of millions of Black people throughout the country, then surely as a Black boy, I can work for our freedom. So it intensely motivated me, but I was always curious. And as I got to know them better, they became, we bonded tremendously. In fact, the Bergmans said they were more like my mother and father, and they said they would take care of me. And they tried, they did. And there are situations that I can never forget and would not want to forget, because that's how meaningful they were to me, and if they are to me.
So the 13 of you, 7 Black, 6 white, are in Washington, D.C. You leave May 4th for this 2-week trip down to New Orleans, you hope, you expect. And you make stops each night. It doesn't take 2 weeks to get to New Orleans, but you intentionally stop each night and test facilities at different bus stations to see if they're complying with recent Supreme Court decisions saying that bus restrooms, restaurants, waiting areas are to be fully integrated. And of course they weren't. But along the way, you needed to stay each night for 2 weeks in the homes of strangers. So tell us about the kindness of strangers. You met people each night who took you into their homes.
That was probably also some most memorable times on the Freedom Rides. Each night we either stopped at a university or a college or a church. We always had dinner together. And if it was a church, we would have a gathering, and one of the brothers would be the speaker for the night. And then they would divvy us out to various members of the congregation. And I guess just one of the things that concerned my mother was the fact that I had never left home before. And here I am staying with strangers throughout the country. But, you know, and I think that concern that any mother would have for a child. But I must admit that the kindness that the people showed us in each one of the stops moving south were tremendous. I mean, they gave us the best they had. I mean, some of the coziest bed cushions. I mean, you know, I didn't realize quilting was such a wonderful art, because during that journey, I slept under some of the nicest quilts. And I mean, it was just wonderful. And to meet people from different regions, you got to realize now, I was 18 years of age. So I was very impressionable. So those memories stayed with me. And I kept a journey as we went along, because I wanted to someday, you know, return the favor, give them a calls, send them a Christmas card, birthday cards, things like that. But the hospitality that we were shown exceeded anything that you get in a 4-star hotel.
Yeah. And tell us about the different roles that you played on different days, the different riders that you played each day. They would switch on different days of the ride, and also why you changed buses. So the roles changing and the buses. Tell us about that.
Each day we changed buses. You know, there were 2 major carriers in those days, Greyhound and Trailway. And the reason we changed buses was because we didn't want to be followed easily. And the reason we could do that is, even though buses were going to the same city, they had different routes, and generally they had different start and departure times. Our role playing on the bus changed each day. First we had designated testers. That was a black and a white. Okay, we also had people who would sit in the place they're supposed to. Like I said, they were black students. A lot of them would sit back in the back. We also had one observer, and that observer was there to, in case something happened, if someone was arrested, they could be there to post bond or to keep track of them, or to, if they needed aid of any sort, they were there for that. It was well thought out, and those roles changed each day as well. I mean, rarely would you attest to 2 days in a row. And we always had a black and a white sitting together in the back. And normally up front, it was just blacks, the students, since most of the blacks were students on our bus. Now, on the other bus, we had some staff members from Cord that were adults. But we, all the blacks on our bus were students.
Yeah. And so you're traveling through the Upper South, and things are going pretty well. So far, so good. And you had, in Atlanta, you had participated in sit-ins and marches to desegregate Atlanta. Then you reach Charlotte, North Carolina, and you inadvertently invent the shoe-in. Tell us about that. How do you invent a shoe-in?
One thing about the student movement is that dress and decorum were essential. And after traveling several days, my shoes had begun to get very scuffed and, you know, scuzzy looking. And my desire to get a shoe shine was not a test, but it was just desire to improve my grooming. And if you know anything about the students during that time, the boys almost always had a shirt and tie. Many times they had a jacket, and the girls always wore Sunday best. So grooming was important, and that was out of just normality. I sought to get my shoes shined, and that was creating a problem. And they would have arrested me had I stayed on the shoe shine stand. But one of the core writers, who was much older than I, he took my place, and they did arrest him, and he spent a couple of days in jail. Took him a couple of days to get back with the rest of the group. Yeah. So that's how a shoe-in started.
Yeah. In jail for wanting a shoe shined. Wow. So, Charles, the Utah Council seeks to foster meaningful relationships, meaningful person-to-person interactions. But the interactions you experienced on Mother's Day in 1961 were not the kind that we want to promote anywhere. So tell us about the interactions that took place in your personal life on Mother's Day in Anniston and Birmingham in 1961.
Actually, my first interactions happened right as we got to the Alabama-Georgia line. And there was this gentleman who was getting off the bus. And since my seat was always the first one as you get on the bus, and he looks at me and he smiles and he says that you have had it good here in Georgia, but you're in Alabama now. Well, I'm thinking, this guy, well, thanks for the warning, but he's getting off the bus. I wasn't worried about him. But little did I know that a couple hours later, I would see him in Birmingham on a very different circumstances. And when we got into Anderson, the same thing. The bus station was closed. Why? Mother's Day, the station was closed. People were milling around outside the station. Also, there was a policeman there. And our bus driver, he gets off and he interacts with them. He gets back and he says, hey, the Greyhound bus has been set afire. And they're taking the people to the hospital by the carloads. Now, we knew that our friends were on that bus. Yet, because of the technology of the day, we had no idea how bad they were, if they were injured at all. But the fact that they were on a bus that had been burning. And then the bus driver asked us to get to the back of the bus. That was not going to happen. And since we did not move to the back of the bus, 8 men get on the bus and they decided to put us in the back of the bus. That was the relationship we had that particular day. That's the kind of interpersonal relations we established that afternoon.
So tell us on that bus. So you're being pummeled on the bus, and tell us about how your white colleagues came to support you. You and Herman Harris are in the front seat of the bus, and these thugs are letting you have it. And then the white colleagues come to your support, Jim Peck and Walter Bergman. What did that mean to you as a Black American?
Well, Dr. Bergman had already told me that he was going to take care of it. So when they saw how we were being beaten and forced towards the back of the bus, they came to aid us. At that point, it made these guys even more angrier than they were at us. They began to beat on Dr. Bergman. They knocked him to the floor of the bus, and they began to stomp him in his chest. And James Peck was a bleeder. And when he fell to the floor of the bus, his blood made it very slippery. And here you have them forcing Herman and I and the other students towards the back. We were stumbling over Dr. Bergman, and we were slipping on James's blood. And eventually it got us to a point where they could physically throw us to the back. And one eyewitness says they stacked us like pancakes. But once they were satisfied, they were in a heap. We were in a heap in the back of the bus. And they sat midway of the bus, and they taunted us all the way into Birmingham. Now, it took us 2 hours to get to Birmingham because our driver had learned that there was a mob waiting for our bus. And had our bus been firebombed or attacked, I don't believe we would have had the energy, the strength, or otherwise to get off a burning bus. So it took us 2 hours to get to Birmingham. And if you've done that route before, you know it's not a 2-hour ride.
Yeah. And then, of course, the book goes into what happened in Birmingham and what happened to the other bus. And we'll leave some for the viewers to read of your, I hesitate to call them adventures, your misfortunes those days. So in your book, Charles, I want to move now briefly to the imperative of today's youth to take up causes that are meaningful to them the way you did 60 years ago. In your book, Charles, you turn the words of the song "Buses Are A-Coming," which was literally true, buses were coming to the South, into an extended metaphor that buses of change are always a-coming, and it's imperative that youth climb aboard them. So how does a person know when a change bus is opening its door for them?
You know when it's time, because there will be things that will happen in your life and you can't get them out of your head. You can't rationalize them. And you realize that if anything's going to happen, if it's going to change, it's going to have to be you. You realize this, and a lot of times we're reluctant and we try to put it off. We'll talk with our friends with that. And that's a good thing, because that's how movements are started. It starts with one person. But the thing is, when your bus comes along, whether it's metaphysical or otherwise, you'll know because your soul will not be at rest. And the reason I say that, there was a situation recently when George Floyd was killed. I was so upset and I was so angry that I called a friend of mine who runs the Freedom Rider National Monument. And I told him, I said, hey, we can do things. We know how to do demonstrations without having violence. We can do it nonviolently. And we should be a spokesperson for these actions. And out of that conversation evolved the Freedom Riders Training Institute, which will be a full-pronged program where we will develop a curriculum that will train policemen, first responders, demonstrators or people who want to demonstrate, and also educators. And hopefully, but that's how I channel the energy. I'm too old to march, can't march anymore, but I can do other things. And that's the idea, is that when your bus comes, you will know it, because you will be compelled to do something. You'll have to do something.
You know, that call of do something from your grandfather, whom you called Papa, is very, very strong in you. Do something. So I want to come back to that make a friend comment that you made the other night in a conversation. And you are one of the most positive, hopeful people I've ever met, despite the experiences you've been through. So I have two questions for you. One, why are you so hopeful? And two, why is making a friend such a clarion call of yours?
One thing I've learned as I've gotten older, there are a lot of good people in this world, and they're not of one color. I've met of all races, all religions, and that encourages me, because I know that we're in good hands. Sometimes we don't work together, we don't work collaboratively, but I know that it exists. And I know it exists because 2 days ago, we had a tornado that landed about 2.5 miles from us. And like always, Americans, what do? We roll up our sleeves and we get out there and we get the job done. But that's always has been the case. And I know we will continue to do that. Excuse me.
So Charles, we have just a few minutes left of our section, and I'd really like our viewers to hear just a section of your book. So I wonder if you could turn to the epilogue of your book. It's on page 265. And if you could read the epigraph by Langston Hughes and then turn to 269 and just read that one paragraph that starts with Langston Hughes. I'd like to finish our section with that.
Tired now of the bitter river. Tired now of the pat on the back. Tired now of the steel bars. Because my face is black. I'm tired of segregation. I'm tired of filth and mud. I've drunk of the bitter river, and it's turned to steel in my blood. Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was tired of the bitter river when he published those words the year I was born. Martin Luther King Jr. was tired of people being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression when he spoke those words in Montgomery in 1955. We Freedom Riders were tired of being denied access to seats on buses, in waiting rooms, and in restrooms in 1961. In 2021, almost 80 years after Hughes, 66 years after King, 60 years after the Freedom Rides, we are still tired. Tired, and so protests come, people march, buses come, people get on board, change comes too.
Thank you, Charles. I wanted to end our section with that because I wanted to use that section as a way just for me to personally say thank you. Thank you for the tiredness you endured, and then the tiredness that you did something about. In your effort 60 years ago to liberate yourself and Black people, you not only liberated and freed and enriched the lives of Black people across America, you enriched the life of an 8-year-old kid in Niagara Falls, New York. I was that child growing up in a life of comfort and privilege, but without the opportunity that you provided, your boarding your bus and changing America not only allowed you as a Black man to sit next to white people, but it allowed me and all white people to sit next to people of color. And that has so enriched my life. My life would be completely different without that. And so I wanted to finish our section by expressing my personal thanks to you for the contribution you've made in my life from the time I was 8 years old to the next 60 years of my life. I'm 68 now. So thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Dick.